The opinions expressed by Recess Logics or Dr. Montano do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of his employer, past or present.
In the intensive care unit, every single decision is literally a matter of life and death. But what if some of the most common, deeply ingrained practices are actually slowing down a patient's recovery, or worse? Today, we're digging into the incredibly high-stakes topic of nutrition for critically ill patients. So, what's this number all about? Well, it points to a massive and mostly hidden crisis. Get this, it's the high end of estimates for malnutrition in ICU patients. As many as 78% of people in the ICU are not getting the nutrition they desperately need to fight for their lives. So, where are we getting all this from? Our guide for this whole explainer comes straight from a team of experts. They published this huge review in the journal Advances in Nutrition, and in it, they systematically took aim at the myths that are leading to that staggering statistic. They are basically calling for a total revolution in how we think about feeding our most vulnerable patients. Now, let's be super clear here. This isn't about pointing fingers at hardworking doctors and nurses. The source makes it plain that the real issue is this kind of sticky, outdated common wisdom. Practices that have been passed down for generations but are now being completely contradicted by hard data. It's really a case of habit versus evidence. So how do we fight back against these myths? Well, the authors put together what is basically a new playbook. This visual guide lays out 9 recommendations, all backed by solid evidence. You can think of this as our roadmap for the rest of this breakdown as we walk through how to change these practices for the better. All right, first up, let's tackle the myths about when to feed. When you're talking about critical illness, the clock is always ticking. And as you're about to see, timing is absolutely everything. Okay, so here's the first big question. A patient's just been admitted, their body is in total crisis mode. Does it make sense to just let their body rest for a day, maybe 2, before starting to give them nutrition through a feeding tube? The old way of thinking was, hey, waiting is safe, let the body rest. But the reality, backed by a ton of studies, is the complete opposite. The recommendation is to start what's called enteral nutrition. That just means using a tube to get food right into the stomach or intestines as soon as possible. We're talking less infections, less time on a ventilator, and even a lower risk of death. Okay, but how big is the gap between what should happen and what is happening? This number is just wow. An international study found that the average delay before starting feeds in the ICU was 46.5 hours. That's almost 2 full days that a critically ill body is being starved of the fuel it needs most. All right, on to the next timing myth. What about after a patient has had major surgery on their gut? The conventional wisdom has always been to hold off on food, to let those new surgical connections heal up without any stress. Sounds pretty logical, right? Well, it sounds logical, but nope, wrong again. The new evidence-backed recommendation is to get feeding started again within 24 hours. Turns out that early nutrition actually reduces complications and helps the digestive system get back on track faster. It's a perfect example of use it or lose it. Okay, so we've established when to start feeding, and the answer is early. Now let's jump into the myths about how to feed, because the method can matter just as much as the timing. For decades, a huge part of ICU nutrition revolved around checking something called gastric residual volume, or GRV. This is where a nurse uses a syringe to pull back fluid from a patient's feeding tube just to see how much of the last meal is still sitting in the stomach. And the old way of doing things was to measure these GRVs all the time, like religiously. The fear was that if that volume was high, it meant the stomach wasn't emptying right, and the patient was at a high risk of vomiting and aspirating that fluid into their lungs, which can cause a really nasty pneumonia. So what's the new recommendation? It's simple. Stop. Just stop measuring them. Major studies have found that checking GRVs doesn't actually lower the risk of pneumonia at all. What it does do is cause feeds to be stopped and started all the time, which just makes malnutrition even worse. The focus should be on actual signs of a problem like vomiting. Okay, let's look at another big how debate. Is it better to run the feeding pump slowly, 24 hours a day in a continuous drip, or is it okay to give bigger feeds over a shorter period of time, kind of like actual meals? That's a method called bolus feeding. So the myth was that the slow, continuous drip is the safer bet. But it turns out the data shows there's really no difference in big outcomes like mortality or pneumonia. Both methods are perfectly fine.
Actually, giving feeds more like meals, the bolus method, is closer to how we normally eat and can give patients more freedom from being tethered to a pump all day long.
All right, we're moving into our final section, and this one might be the most crucial of all. We've talked about when and how. Now let's talk about who and challenge some old assumptions about patients who are often thought to be too sick to be fed. Okay, this is a really big one. A patient is in shock, they're on powerful drugs called vasopressors to keep their blood pressure up. The fear has always been that blood is being shunted away from the gut, and that if you feed them, you could cause a catastrophic injury where the intestines literally start to die from lack of oxygen. So, do you stop the feeds?
The old rule was simple: stop all feeding, no questions asked. But the evidence now supports a smarter approach. For patients on stable, low to moderate doses of these drugs, the recommendation is actually to start feeding slowly. You have to remember, the gut is an organ too, and just like any other organ, it needs fuel to stay healthy. Starving it can actually make things worse.
And this whole feed the gut principle applies in other tricky situations too, which brings us to two more myths. First, it's safe to feed patients who are medically paralyzed with neuromuscular blockers. Those drugs affect the big muscles, not the gut. And second, it is also safe to feed patients who are positioned on their stomachs. That's a practice called proning. The takeaway is the same. The default should always be to feed. So, wow. After busting all those myths, let's kind of take a step back and see why this all matters so much. This isn't about just making little tweaks here and there. This is about creating a whole new standard of care in the ICU.
I think this quote from the authors really sums up the new mindset perfectly. Our approach is to treat every patient admitted to the ICU as at risk for malnutrition and to initiate enteral nutrition upon admission. See that? You don't wait for problems to show up. You assume every single patient is at risk from the moment they get there, and you act right away. It's a huge shift from being reactive to being totally proactive. So let's look at that framework one last time. From feeding early to ditching the GRV checks to feeding patients on vasopressors, these 9 recommendations are all about replacing old myths with new evidence. And they all point toward one single critical goal: helping our sickest patients get better, faster. This kind of knowledge has the power to genuinely change outcomes and save lives in ICUs all over the world. And it really leaves us with one final big question. If this much common wisdom was so wrong in this one area, what other long-held medical dogma is out there, just waiting for the data to finally catch up?